I married into the Vahl funeral firm at 29 to keep my father's name over his door, and on the fourth night I heard the three wives before me. They are not ghosts. All three are alive, and all three were paid to go. The back stair runs from the chapel of rest up to what used to be the coachman's rooms and is now the flat that the family puts its new wives in, and it is the only part of that building that has not been carpeted. And on the fourth night I heard two women talking on it at about 11 o'clock. I want to describe what that is actually like, because it is not what the films do. There was no cold, nothing moved. I was standing in a kitchen with a glass of water, and I heard, from the other side of a closed door, at exactly the volume of a conversation in a corridor, a woman say, "He has not lied to you once. That is the thing. He will not lie. He will just let you carry on being wrong." And another woman, older, further off, said, "Ask her about the January transfer." And I opened the door, and there was a stair and nobody on it. I did not scream, and I did not run out of the building, and I have thought about why, and the answer is that I had been in that house 4 days, and I already knew that both of those sentences were true. He had not lied to me, and there was a January transfer, because I had seen the reference on a bank screen over Ilse Vahl's shoulder on my second afternoon, and had thought nothing of it at all. My father's name is over a door in Fenwick Street. Sandoe and Son, established 1974, which is a lie of the modest kind, because there was never a son, there was me, and my father put and Son on the fascia in 1974, because in that town, in that decade, a woman's name over a funeral director's door was thought to be a difficulty. He is 71. He buried my mother out of that building in 2011 and did the whole thing himself, because he would not let anybody else touch her. And I sat in the front car at 15 and watched the back of his head, and that is the single fact about my family that explains everything I have ever done. Sandoe and Son does about 90 funerals a year. The Vahls do 1,100 across 5 branches in 4 counties, and they have done since 1861, and they own the crematorium at Aldermarsh and the monumental masons on the bypass and about half the freeholds in the trade in this part of the country. In the January of the year I turned 29, my father had a stroke, a small one, the kind that takes a word here and there and leaves everything else, and he could not run a business, and the business had 11 months of cash and a bank that had noticed. And Ilse Vahl came to see him in the hospital with a proposal that she described accurately as a solution. The Vahls would buy Sandoe and Son. The fascia would stay. The name stays over the door, in perpetuity, written into the sale agreement, which matters to nobody on earth except my father and about 400 families in that town who will not be buried by a chain. And I would come into the firm, and I would marry Casimir. Nobody held a gun to my head, and nobody has ever pretended otherwise. What Ilse Vahl did in a hospital to a man who had lost the word for Thursday is that she offered him the only version of the future in which his wife's grave is tended by somebody called Sandoe, and then she left it with him for 9 days. He asked me in a corridor. He could not look at me, and he could not find the word for it, and what he actually said was, "Would you for the door?" And I said yes in about 4 seconds, and I would do it again. And that is not tragedy. That is just what a family firm is. A thing people trade their own lives for and then cannot explain afterwards to anybody who did not grow up in one. 4 things about my father, because he is the reason for all of it, and because a man who trades his daughter for a fascia board needs to be a person and not a device. He has laid out about 11,000 people. He can tell you what year a coffin fitting is from across a room. In 1989, he buried a family of 4 out of that building after a fire on the Marchmont estate and did not charge them, and the town knows, and nobody has ever said it to his face because he would leave the room. He taught me the only rule he has, which is that you never let a family see you look at your watch, and he taught it by making me stand at the back of 40 funerals when I was 14 with my hands where he could see them. And the thing about him that nobody outside the trade understands is that he is not sentimental about death at all, not one bit. He is sentimental about the door, about a name on a fascia in a street where his own father swept the step. I have been asked about 9 times since whether I resent him for the corridor, for would you, for the door, and the honest answer is that it is the only thing he has ever asked me for in 29 years, and that I have watched him not ask for things my whole life, and that a man who cannot say Thursday asking his daughter for one thing is not a man you say no to. I would like to be angrier about it than I am. Casimir Vahl is 41, and he is the coldest person I have ever met, and he has never been unkind to me for 1 minute. I want that on the record early because everybody expects a monster, and he is not one, and the not being one is the whole difficulty. He runs the operational side of 1,100 funerals a year, and he is superb at it, and I mean that in the way the trade means it. He can walk into a room where a family is coming apart and reduce the temperature by 4 degrees without saying anything clever, and he has done it in front of me perhaps 200 times, and I still cannot see the mechanism. He remembers what people take in their tea. He goes to the crematorium at Aldermarsh at 7 on Christmas morning every year, alone, to check the chapel, because his grandfather did. And in 11 months of marriage, he asked me 2 questions about myself, both of them logistical. And when I told him in the April that my father had had a second stroke, he said, "Which branch do you want covering?" Which is not coldness exactly, it is a man reaching for the only instrument he has. The 3 of them told me about him. That is what the Back Stair actually was, in the end, and I worked it out in about the 5th week. It is not a haunting, and it is not a warning, it is a residue. Whatever that house does, and I have no theory, and I have stopped wanting one, it repeats the things women said in it in the weeks before they left, and what those women were doing in those weeks was working him out. Ines, who was first, is analytical and asks questions of the empty air. Berit, who was second, is angry and says the same 4 sentences over and over. Halla, who was third and who left in 2021, mostly cries, and once, at about 2 in the morning in my 9th week, said, "I only want to know if the money is real," and I sat down on the floor of that kitchen, because it was the first time any of them had said anything that was not about him. I should say what the work is, because everybody who hears funeral director hears something gothic, and the actual job is the opposite of gothic. It is domestic. It is ringing a crematorium about a slot. It is knowing that the Aldermarsh Chapel takes 40, and the Fenwick Street one takes 110, and that a family who says there will only be a few of us is wrong about 11 times out of 20. It is a woman of 80 in your office at 9 in the morning saying she does not know what he would have wanted because they never discussed it, and you saying, "Most people never do," which is true and which is the single most useful sentence in the trade. It is carrying. And the reason I say all that is that in 18 months inside the Vahl firm, I did the work every day alongside people who were superb at it, and the thing I could not reconcile then and cannot reconcile now is that the same organization that did that for 1,100 families a year, properly, with real care, at 4 in the morning, in the rain, was also quietly holding 6 million pounds of other people's funerals in a loan note. Nobody in the chapel of rest knew. That is what I would want understood. 91 people got up every day and did the hardest work there is, and did it well, and 4 people in an office upstairs had arranged the money in a way that would eventually make all of it worthless. And the 4 people upstairs were not cynics. They were a family that had confused the firm with the trust because their grandfather had, and nobody had ever made them separate the 2. A prepaid funeral plan is a promise held in trust. That is the thing at the bottom of all of it, and it takes 90 seconds. A person of 74 walks into a funeral director's on Fenwick Street and pays £2,800 now for a funeral they will need in about 11 years, and they do it because they are careful and because they do not want their daughter to have to find it, and it is one of the most decent things people do, and the money is not the funeral director's money. It goes into a trust held by trustees, invested, and the funeral director gets paid out of the trust when the person dies and the funeral is delivered. That is the entire architecture, and it exists for one reason, which is that between the payment and the funeral there is a decade in which a business can go under, and the trust is what stands between 11,000 old people and nothing. The Vahl Family Funeral Plan Trust holds, or is supposed to hold, 11,400 plans, and since 2009 it has been lending money back to the operating company. That is the fraud, and it is not exotic, and it is not clever, and it is, I am told by everybody who has looked at it since, extremely common. The trust deed permits investment. Investment includes, on a reading that Ilse Vahl obtained from a solicitor in 2009 and has relied on ever since, a secured loan to a connected party at a commercial rate. So the trust lends to the firm, and the firm buys freeholds and a crematorium and a competitor in Fenwick Street, and the trust holds a loan note instead of an investment portfolio, and the loan note is worth exactly what the firm is worth, and the firm is worth what it is worth because of the things it bought with the money. It is a snake eating itself, and it works perfectly for as long as nobody needs to be buried faster than plans are sold. I did the wrong thing with it first, and it cost me 4 months and very nearly everything. And the February, with the shape of it in my head and nothing on paper, I asked Ilse Vahl a direct question, not an accusation. I asked her in her own office pleasantly, as a member of the family and a director of a branch, what the trust's investments were, and she answered me, completely, patiently, for about 11 minutes, with a folder, and everything she said was true, that the trust holds a secured loan note, that the security is a first charge over 4 freeholds, that the rate is commercial and set by reference to an external benchmark, that the arrangement was approved by the trustees and supported by a legal opinion in 2009, and that she would be happy to give me a copy of the opinion, which she did, on the spot, without hesitating. And I went away with a folder and an opinion and the complete conviction that I had been paranoid, and I did nothing at all for 4 months. That is what a good, quiet architect actually looks like, not a locked drawer. A woman who hands you the file because the file is genuinely fine, because the fraud is not in any document. It is in the fact that the security is a charge over property that was bought with the borrowed money, so that if the firm goes, the freeholds go with it, and the charge is over nothing. It took me until the June and a woman in Aberdeen to see it, and Ines saw it in 2009 in about a fortnight, and the difference between us is that she had been an insurance underwriter for 6 years, and I sell funerals. Ilse Vahl has administered the trust since 2009. She is 66. She is Casimir's aunt. She is not a director of the operating company and never has been, and her title is trust administrator, which is a job that in most firms is done by a woman with a filing cabinet. She has never in her life been photographed for anything. She does not attend the family lunches, and what she has, and what took me 11 months to see, is the only thing in that entire organization that matters, which is that she is a trustee of the trust and also the person who prepares the papers that the other 2 trustees approve, and the other 2 trustees are a retired solicitor of 81 and Casimir's mother. That is the whole architecture. There is no forgery anywhere in this story, and no signature is wrong, and every minute is genuine. 3 trustees met 4 times a year for 16 years and approved what was in front of them, and what was in front of them was prepared by the person the approval was protecting, and that is not a crime in this country, and it should be. I found the shape of it, not the detail, in the January, and I found it because of the back stair. Ines, who was first, who I had never met, and who at that point I did not know was alive, said one sentence in the small hours of a Tuesday in the 11th week that gave me everything. She said, "Ask her why the trust has one asset. A trust holding 11,000 plans and £6.1 million should hold gilts and funds and cash across 40 lines, and if it holds one asset, then the one asset is a loan, and if the one asset is a loan, then the money is not there. And I sat on the floor of that kitchen at 1:30 in the morning and understood that I was being briefed by somebody who had done this before me and had been better at it than I was. The first one lives in Aberdeen now. That took me 4 months, and it was the hardest and least dramatic work I have ever done. Nobody in that family will say those women's names. There is no photograph of any of them in that house, and Casimir's mother refers to all three, when she refers to them at all, as the difficult period. What there is, because this is a firm and not a family, is paperwork. 3 marriages are 3 certificates, and 3 certificates are a matter of public record and cost £11 each, and 3 divorces are 3 case numbers. And a woman who has changed her name has usually changed it to one she had before. Ines Larsdatter, married 2007, separated 2009. Berit Foss, married 2012, separated 2016. Halla Nord, married 2019, separated 2021. I wrote to all 3 by hand on plain paper with no letterhead, and I said who I was and that I was not asking them to do anything, and that I would like to buy them a cup of tea. Ines replied in 9 days. Berit replied in 5 weeks with 2 lines that said, "Please do not write to me again," which I respected, and then wrote again herself in the August. Halla never replied, and I have never approached her since, and she is in this account only because she is in that stair. Berit's 5 weeks of silence, and then her letter in the August is its own story, and I am going to give it 4 sentences, because she asked me to give it none. She wrote because her mother died in the July, and was buried on a plan her mother had bought from the Vahls in 2014. She sat through her own mother's funeral, knowing what she knew, and it was, she says, a good funeral, delivered properly, by people who were kind to her. And what she wrote to me, at the end of 2 pages, is the sentence that I have thought about more than anything Ines said. They will bury everybody perfectly right up until the day they cannot, and the day they cannot is not going to be in my lifetime or yours. It is going to be some woman in 2040 in a room with a coffin and no money. I sat in a kitchen in Aberdeen in the June with a woman of 44 who has a dog and a job in a housing association, and she made me a cup of tea and put the biscuits on a plate rather than in the packet, which I noticed, and then she said, before I had asked her anything at all, "You've heard us on the stair." And I said yes, and Ines Larsdatter said, "So did I. I heard the 2 before me," which is when the last of my ideas about what that house is went out of the window, because there were only 2 before her, and the 2 before her are Casimir's grandfather's wives, and one of them died in 1994, and the other one is in a home in Perth and is 91, and the thing on that stair is not 3 women, and it is not a message. It is a habit that building has, and it has had it for a long time, and everybody in that family knows, and not one of them has ever once said so out loud. Halla is the one I got wrong, and I want to put it in because the version where I handle all 3 women well is not true. I wrote to her twice. When she did not answer, I did the thing I had been told not to do by Ines, and told myself I was doing for good reasons. I found her workplace. She teaches music at a school in the Borders, and I got as far as the car park, and I sat in the car for about 40 minutes and then drove home. And the only reason I did not go in is that a woman came out of the side door with a cello case, and it was not her, and my whole body reacted as though it had been. And I understood, sitting in that car, exactly what I was about to do to somebody. She left that house in 2021, and she is the one on the stair who cries. I have heard her at 2 in the morning saying a sentence about the money being real, and I used it, and I built a case on it, and she has never given me permission for any of that, and never will, and there is no mechanism by which I could have asked. That is the part of this I would take back if I could take one thing back. Not the letters, not the regulator, the car park. Every one of those agreements says the same thing. That is the mechanism, and it is the reason there is a story here at all. And I did not know it until Ines put her copy on the kitchen table in Aberdeen and let me read it. A settlement agreement, which is what people mean when they say a non-disclosure agreement, is a contract, and the ones the Vahls used are very good and very expensive, and they are drafted to be as wide as a court will let them be. She may not discuss the marriage, the family, the firm, its finances, or the circumstances of the separation, with any person in perpetuity on pain of repaying the whole of the settlement. And then, because it is a professionally drafted agreement in this country, and because the drafters were not fools, there is a clause about 2/3 of the way down that says nothing in this agreement prevents disclosure of information to a regulator or law enforcement body, or the making of a protected disclosure. It has to be there. An agreement that gagged somebody from talking to a regulator would not merely be unenforceable, it would be evidence of something on its own, and no solicitor of that quality would ever draft one. So all 3 of those women for 16 years had been silenced in every direction except one, and the one direction they were free to speak in was the only one that could actually do anything, and not one of them had used it. I asked Ines why, and she said, because you don't know that's what it means. You read it once, in a room, at the worst week of your life, with a solicitor your husband's family is paying for, and what you take away is that you can never talk about it. Nobody ever says to you, you can ring the regulator on Monday. Thank you for listening to Channel Crystal Novel. They came at me in the September, and it was Dagny, and it was the most effective thing anybody did to me in 18 months. Casimir's mother is 74, and she has buried a husband and a son, and the son is the part I did not know until that afternoon. There was a boy called Rurik, who died at 19 in 1998, and he is not spoken of either, and there is no photograph of him in that house any more than there is of the wives. She came up to the flat, which she had done twice in 18 months, and she sat down and she said, I know what you have been doing. And then she did not threaten me. She told me about 1998 for about 20 minutes, in detail, quietly, including the part where the firm buried its own, and Casimir was 14 and helped, at 14, because that is what the family does, and she said that the reason her son is the way he is, the reason he cannot ask a woman a question about herself, is that at 14 he carried his own brother and was told he had done it beautifully. And then she said, so when you decide what you are going to do, I would like you to understand that you are not deciding about a business. And she went. And that is not a lie, and it is not even manipulation exactly. It is a woman telling the truth about her family for the first time in 27 years in order to make a particular use of it. And I sat in that flat for about 2 hours afterwards and did not move. What got me up in the end was arithmetic and not feeling. 11,400 people. That is the number, and I had it written on a card in a drawer by then. Not 11,400 customers. 11,400 people of about 74 who did a careful thing so that their daughters would not have to, and about 600 of whom die every year, and every one of those 600 funerals is paid for out of a loan note secured on a firm whose value is the freeholds it bought with the money. I nearly did it wrong at the end, too, and the person who stopped me was Ines. In the September after Dagny, I wanted to put it to Casimir first, not out of loyalty and not to warn him, but because 18 months in that house had left me with a completely irrational need for him to hear it from me, rather than from a letter, which is the exact instinct that has kept every family firm's worst arrangement alive for 100 years. And Ines said one thing on the telephone that ended it. She said, I told him in 2009. Nan mea nanan, janan, nanan hantanchian, nanan handun nakentis banchian, nanan handul tom, nanin jo arfu hom nim banderhom, nanan amando hom the ninian, nanan no mandamandian the amananan the neananan dandu, Nendamiamandad, Manananina Mananduamenamantindim Benanambianandan Habiam Bend, Nanandim Dendan Daviam Tamsaman Intamananam, Nandindin Manandin Bendamanandam Mandam Bandatikinan Mamanda, Manandandamba, Mananandam Biandam Bundandam Mindanandan Manpa, Danambanindan Manandam Bumba Piantan Dendinda, Dundin Bin Bandandam Blinton Dumpin Bandam Bandam Bamba, Dumpin Bumban Dumpin Bundinda. And he listened, and he thanked her, and he said he would look into it. And then he went and asked his aunt, and his aunt explained it to him for 11 minutes with a folder. And 9 weeks later, Ines Larsdottir signed an agreement in a solicitor's office and moved to Aberdeen. He did not conspire. He asked the person he had been asking his whole life, and he believed her, the way he believed her about everything, and then he let his wife go rather than hold 2 ideas in his head at once. That is not innocence. There is a word for what that is, and I have not found it in 3 years. The 4 of us did it on a Tuesday. That is the whole climax, and it took 11 minutes, and nobody shouted at anybody. Ines wrote to the Financial Conduct Authority, which regulates prepaid funeral plans in this country and has since 2022, and which is the fact that made all of it possible, because before 2022 there was no regulator to disclose to, and those agreements were, in practice, total. Berit wrote to the same address on the same morning. Halla, who I had never met and never contacted, wrote too, because Ines rang her and asked her, and I have still never spoken to that woman, and she has never spoken to me, and she wrote 4 pages. And I wrote as a director of the operating company, which I had become in the March, because Casimir wanted a Sandoe on the board of the Fenwick Street branch, and had not thought about it any harder than that. 4 letters, 1 morning, 4 different postcodes, each one citing the clause in its own agreement that permits it, each one attaching that agreement so that the regulator could see for itself that 3 women had been paid to be quiet about a trust, and that the payments had come from the firm the trust had lent to. The regulator does not do drama. There was no raid and no telephone call and no man in a coat. What there was, 11 weeks later, on a Thursday, was a letter to the trustees requiring the immediate provision of a statement of the trust's assets, and a second letter appointing a skilled person to report. And it is the most boring pair of documents in this account, and it ended the Vahl family's control of that firm in under a year. The wider effect is the only part of this I would put in front of somebody as a reason it was worth doing. The skilled person's report went to the regulator in the second winter, and the regulator opened a thematic review of trust-based plan providers, which is the dullest phrase in this account, and that review looked at 31 trusts and found 4 more holding a single connected party loan as their principal asset, and 2 of those 4 have since been restructured, and 1 has been wound up and its plan holders transferred. That is somewhere north of 19,000 people who will be buried the way they paid to be in 3 counties I have never visited, because a woman in Aberdeen kept a folder for 16 years. The rules changed too. A trustee who prepares the papers may no longer be the person the papers protect, which is 1 sentence, and which is the whole of Ilse Vahl written into a rule book without her name on it. The regulator intervened in the spring. The skilled person's report found that the trust held 1 asset, a loan note of £6.4 million to the operating company, that it had held 1 asset since 2011, that the interest had been rolled up rather than paid since 2016, and that the trust could not meet its obligations to plan holders in the event of the firm's failure. Ilse Vahl was removed as trustee and is subject to proceedings that will not conclude for another 2 years, and she has never spoken publicly, and I do not expect her to, and she is the only person in this whole business who has never once seemed frightened. The firm was sold under supervision to a group I do not much like, who kept every branch open and every one of the 91 staff, and who paid the trust a sum that closed the whole. and the 11,400 plans are funded and portable, and every one of those people will be buried the way they paid to be. That is the outcome, and it is the only one I ever wanted, and it took 19 months. Emmerich Vahl was disqualified as a director for 8 years. Casimir was not. He was found by the skilled person to have had no involvement in the administration of the trust, which is true, and which is the most damning sentence anybody has written about him, because he ran that firm for 11 years and never once asked where the money for the freeholds came from. He has never asked me about the letter, not once in 3 years. We were divorced in the second spring, uncontested, in about 11 minutes of a solicitor's time, and the only thing he said to me in the whole of it was in a corridor, and it was, "Your father's name stays on the door." I made it a condition, and it is on the door. It is on the door now, on Fenwick Street, over a branch owned by a group in Leeds, and my father is 74 and cannot really read it any more, and I take him past it on a Sunday, and he looks at it every time. There is a coda about the money, and I would rather say it than have somebody work it out. The 3 settlements came to about £410,000 across 16 years, and they were paid by the operating company, and the operating company was funded by a loan from the trust. So 11,400 people of about 74 who paid £2,800 each so that their daughters would not have to find it, paid for 3 women to stop talking about the fact that the money was gone. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the actual flow of funds, and it is in the skilled person's report at paragraph 9, in the flattest language you have ever read, and when I first read that paragraph, I had to put the report down and go and stand in the yard. Nobody has ever apologized to those 11,400 people, because nobody ever tells them. Their plans were transferred, their funerals are funded, and not one of them received a letter saying what had nearly happened, because the regulator's view, which is correct, is that telling 40,000 elderly people across 3 counties that their funeral money was nearly gone would cause more harm than it prevents. So it was fixed silently, which is the right answer, and it means the entire population of people this was actually done to will die not knowing any of it happened. I run Fenwick Street. That is the thing nobody expected, including me. The group offered me the branch manager's job in the settlement, and I took it, because 90 funerals a year in one town is the only work I have ever wanted, and because a woman who has just reported a trust to the regulator is not, it turns out, unemployable in this trade. She is quite the opposite. Ines and I speak about once a month. She has never come south, and I have been to Aberdeen 4 times, and we do not discuss the Vahls. We discuss her dog and my father, and a truly enormous amount of nonsense. Berit sent a card when the report was published, with nothing in it but her name. Halla I have still never met, and Ines tells me she is well, and that is all I know, and all I am owed. And the flat above the chapel of rest is empty. The group uses the building and has carpeted the back stair, which I have thought about a great deal, and I have never once gone back to find out whether that made any difference, because there is a version of this in which I stand in that kitchen at 11 at night to see whether a woman who is not there says something about me, and I have decided that woman is not somebody I need to be. What I would say, if anybody in a position like that is listening, is the thing Ines said over a plate of biscuits in Aberdeen, and it is not about ghosts, and it is not about marriages. Read the clause. Whatever they made you sign, at the worst week of your life, with their solicitor being kind to you across a table, there is a paragraph about 2/3 of the way down, and it is there because it has to be there, and it says you can always tell a regulator. Nobody will ever point at it. It has been sitting in 3 women's drawers in 3 towns for 16 years. So here is what I want to know from you, since you have been on that stair with me the whole way. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next.